By the end of this video, you'll have a custom flashcard app of your own that's created using a combination of both Bubble and OpenAI. This app will essentially allow your users to add in some information of a particular topic they would like to study. So for instance, they could grab some text from a blog post, some study notes, or anything else in between. From there, we'll feed all of this information into OpenAI, from which it's going to then create a series of flashcards that it can then quiz you on. This is a great tutorial that explains how you can build a custom SaaS app in less than an hour. Look, there's so much that we need to cover, so I'm going to hand this one over to Luca, and he's going to walk through everything you need to know.
Hi everyone, Luca here. Today we're going to be building a flashcard application where users will be able to put in their lecture material into this multi-line input here, and then it's going to automatically be able to generate flashcards for them using ChatGPT. So we just go to Y Combinator to get some information. So 18, biggest mistake the startups make, for example, and we're just going to copy this text and then paste it into our application here, and then hit generate. It's going to be sending it to ChatGPT. And really, the main thing that we're going to be learning today is how to express a ChatGPT output as a JSON object so you can use it in repeating groups like this. So as you can see, now we've got our flashcards. When we click them, it's going to go to the back of flashcards. And this is really using the second main thing we're going to be learning today, which is how to get ChatGPT to give you a JSON format in the first place. And then obviously we're going to be learning how to enable Bubble to recognize that as an actual object or an array, so we can use it in this repeating group. But obviously, yeah, this is quite a cool application. You can see all the different things you could possibly do with being able to get ChatGPT output as a list in your applications, and you can do this with any different types of data and any different configurations. So without further ado, let's jump into the build. If we go to our editor here, I'm just going to create a new page. Now you're going to need at least a starter plan here because we're going to be using the application's own API as well as backend workflows. So that's a quick note for this. So the first thing we're going to do in our multi-steps is, obviously we've done the demo, but now we're just going to build out the front end initially, so what the user sees, and then the back end, so how we're going to get all the data formatting properly in all of our groups. So for starters, let's drag a group onto the page. Let's quickly format the layout of the page to be a column so we can make it responsive if we needed to. And then let's just expand this so it can be unchecked on the fixed width and height. Now the next thing we're going to do is just grab a nice text title here for our application, add 100 pixels on the top, then 20 pixels left and right because we're going to do a nice gradient design. So I'm just going to type in here magic flashcards, then let's set it to a nice 24 and bold. Let's add a gradient background like we did in the demo. Let's do red on 40%. Intermediate color can be green on 40%. And then let's do a nice pink for this one. Again on 40%. Then turn this white. And then just add 10 pixels of rounding on the sides. Perfect. That looks pretty good. Next thing we're going to want is, again, multi-line input. So let's drag that in, again center it in the middle of the page. Let's put 20 pixels margin on top. I'm going to make this fixed width 500 and also fixed height as well of 500. Perfect. Now the last thing for this section is going to be a button. So if we just go to our visual elements here, grab a button and 20 pixels on the top for this one as well. Again, make it fixed width on 500 so just aligns nicely, and then again roundness 10. Then rename the label to generate. Obviously how you actually yourself design this is completely up to you, but I think the gradient looks quite nice, so I'm going to do that again for the button. I'm going to hit the gradient. We did the top as pink, intermediate color was green. Obviously if this was a proper production application, you'd maybe want to get the exact hex codes, etc. I'm just doing a speed run here. So, and then let's make that slightly bigger again. Perfect. So this is our first initial group. We're going to be putting in our lecture material here and then clicking generate and doing all the backend workflows. So the next thing we need is that repeating group for our actual flashcards themselves. We want to add not within this group here because we want to not show this essentially when we don't have any flashcards. So I want them to set beside each other. So if we actually just go onto our page again and then hit row, that looks pretty good. I'm just going to set this center of the column and then vertically align the center again. 20 pixels margin on the left and the right. And then make it fixed width 500 and min height. Let's do fixed height again at 500, maybe 800. So it displays the whole page. Lovely. So for this repeating group, let's rename it flashcards. Perfect. We're going to want to add our actual flashcard itself. But before we do that, just uncheck the amount of rows here and then make the background style flat color. And a quick way to get to a certain number of grays every time is I just hit black and then hit a very low percentage and it makes it a nice gray. That's easy and quickly to get to. That's easily, sorry Kevin. And yeah, using this way of just doing 1% with black just makes it a lot quicker and reproducible. So next thing, let's get rid of our borders here as well as our separators. Now we're ready to actually put our card in. So now we just need to drag a group into our repeating group. Let's center it in the middle, horizontally and vertically, and then make fixed width and height. And I'm just going to do 300 for that. Perfect. I'm just going to rename it to group card. Let's hit the roundness is 10 because that's what we've done for all the other things. In fact, this was 5, so let's do that so it's a bit more visually pleasing. And let's go back onto our group in our repeating group. And so we can actually see it, we're going to make the background white, which is why we've made our group black here. But let's actually add 10 pixels or 20 pixels on the top actually. Let's do that. Perfect. And I think it's actually a little bit hard to see our flashcards here, so I'm just gonna go back and make the background of our repeating group 2% instead of 1%, and that's much nicer looking. So next thing we're going to want to do is grab a piece of text, drop that into our group here, go into layout, centrally align it, which is looking perfect here. I'm just going to leave the date of this blank right now, and this is actually all we need to do at this moment for UI design. This is all elements that we're actually going to need for this whole build. So if we move on to here, we've done our repeating group. Now we need to set up our OpenAI call. So essentially, all it is a basic completions call. If you're familiar with the ChatGPT API, you're going to want to make an account, so you're going to be able to access your API key so you can make this call. But essentially, under here, you've got all the different things you can do with ChatGPT. This is just the chat create completions call, is all the API calls we're going to be sending to OpenAI today. But you can see down here, we've got this response format, and this is so we can actually display it in our repeating group as a JSON object. So it's going to be essentially the basic API call, which is this. This is your header. So this is just telling OpenAI that it's expecting it as JSON, and then your authorization here. And we're going to actually be adding this response format in after this in this section here. But before we do that, let's get authenticated. So if we go to our plugins here, what you're going to want to do is grab, if we collapse all these ones so it looks a bit easier. What you're going to want to do is essentially add a new plugin if you don't have the OpenAI API, if you don't have the Bubble API connector yet, and you're going to want to search it in here by just typing in API connector. You want to install that, and then you want to click add another API. Let's rename it OpenAI flashcards, and the actual call, which is gets us that JSON response back, is going to go in here, and essentially this bit of the API call is going to be just handling the right format and our authentication. So OpenAI's private key and header, and we need to also add a shared header. The shared header is content dash type, and then it's application slash JSON. And for our private key here, we're going to want to generate an API key. So if you logged into this platform.openai, all they need is just an email and a password. All you have to do is go to your dashboard, go to your API keys, and generate a new secret key and create a new secret key. Then you're going to want to copy that, go to your bubble editor, type in bare space, and then paste in your API key here. And in the actual documentation for our call, if we go to the API reference and go to chat, you can see what we've just coded in is this section of the API call here. So now we need this part of it. So all we're going to do is literally just copy it. You don't want to copy this little apostrophe. You want everything after the apostrophe and then before the last apostrophe. So the two curly brackets, you're going to hit copy, go to your bubble editor, and then expand your API call. Now, before we paste that into this section here, we're going to want to change this to post. And when we change it to post, we can now copy our body in here. Now we'll call this anything you like, get flashcard JSON, and it's going to be an action because we're going to need to be able to use it in our workflows. If it's data, if you still have this as data, that will be why you maybe can't see it as an action in later steps. So make sure you turn this to action here. And what we need in this section is what's called the endpoint. So the URL that we're sending our payload to. So if we go to API reference again, we can see that this is our endpoint. So if we just copy everything into completions and then paste it into here, we can now actually test this API call to make sure it's working. As you can see, we've got a good response. So now we're ready to go. We are going to need to obviously add in our format section here and be able to change the system message and the content. In fact, we can keep the actual system because we always want to be a system for this call because it has to be a system message for the format response to actually work. We're going to just change it in here. But for the actual user content, we're going to want our users to be able to dynamically change, obviously, the lecture material that they're sending into the API. So to create a dynamic data field in here, all we have to do is do a greater than sign and another greater than sign and then put a word in here. So we'll call this lecture underscore material. And as you can see now, we can just add whatever we want in here dynamically. We're going to uncheck private. And now the last thing we need to do before we add in our response format section is instruct our GPT what it's going to be doing. Now, in the one that I made earlier, I used, if we just go back quickly and check, if I copy this, then we move down, you guys can just copy the words. And you might want to obviously have a different instruction depending on if you're making an application maybe only for younger children or university degree people, then it would obviously change what you write in this section. But I've just kept it super simple. You are a flashcard making assistant. Please respond in valid JSON format. Now this is very important because that's needs to happen for it to actually respond in the JSON format. And then we're asking for the following parameters in our object that is going to be recognized by the repeating group. And we've said front and back for each flashcard. Perfect. Now we need to actually add our response format section. And if you see here, we have our square brackets with a comma, and then we have this piece, which they actually gave us. If we go to API reference, you've got type JSON object, and in our API call, we've got type JSON object, but we need to actually define what this is. And so you're going to need to do the response format : and then paste in this type of JSON part of it. So I'm just gonna copy this, and you can see here versus here, there is no comma. So we're gonna want to add a comma, enter, and then paste in our response format section, and everything's looking pretty good. So now we can add in some lecture material. For example, I'm just gonna copy a little bit of this, paste that in, and initialize. Cool. Let's see what we get back. Perfect. We've got a good response, and if we show our raw data here, you can see that our content is in the JSON format, which is great. So it's created an object called flashcards, and then we've got our first flashcard front back, and then we've got a second flashcard front and back here. So that is all formatted perfectly. Now we're gonna circle back and make some changes here, and I'll describe what we're actually doing later on. But what I'm actually gonna do is, instead of using GPT-4, I'm gonna change it to a faster model, so our users will be able to get a quicker response. So any models newer than 3.5 Turbo 101. So let's have a look at models here. If we go introduction, making requests, messages, let's find a model 1106, newer than 1106. Continuous model, let's have a look. Let's try GPT 3.5 Turbo. Reinitialize, invalid model IDs. Let's actually click on that. Okay, so the latest one, we've got our one, everything after this. So let's use the newest version of that one and pop it in. If we go here, initialize cool, nice, sweet. So now our OpenAI call is all set up. We need to actually create a call that takes that output JSON, and formats it for Bubble. So this backend workflow call is essentially giving it the application JSON tag on it to help Bubble recognize it. And then we're actually sending this with the application JSON tag through our own API, so we can use it as a JSON object using this call here. So let's go on to our backend workflow for now. Go to backend workflows. You're going to want to add a new API workflow. Let's name this flash _JSON. And the actual name is going to be important because that's how we're going to be calling it in our API. You can now just leave that. But the last thing we need to do is add a parameter. This is just going to be called input, and we're going to leave that as text. Then we're going to return data from an API, either content type. So if you remember that content type application JSON, that's essentially what we're passing here. So we just need to type application /JSON, and then the thing that we're actually doing this to is that input of the API workflow, which is going to be calling from our own API, which I know sounds a little bit confusing, but it works quite nicely. So that backend workflow is now set up. The next thing we need to do is set up that API call that's going to call that backend workflow, which is going to take the text, do all the stuff, the application JSON content type header to it, and then feed it back to us like how we're doing this. And it's all formatted as a JSON object that we can use in our repeating groups. So you're going to need, as I said before, at least a starter plan for this. And we're just going to add another API here. Let's call it my application. We add two headers again, application /JSON, although that needs to be in here for the value. And then there's content -type here. And then here, we're actually going to need authorization. So I'm pretty bad at spelling, so I'm just going to grab how it's spelled here, paste it into here. We're going to need to do our bearer space, and then we need to grab our own API key, which if you go to settings and API, this will be your API key here. You can hit generate if you haven't generated one before, and this should pop up. So if we go back to plugins, we can now paste that here, and now we're ready to actually do the call itself. Make sure there's one space here. So the call is going to be calling that backend workflow, that API workflow. So we actually want to leave this as data. We don't want to have it as an action, because then we won't be able to call it in our workflow as a external API, even though technically it's a internal API. But let's call this API call trigger backend. Perfect. And the endpoint we're going to be calling is just our base URL, which is this one here in the API tab. However, we need a slash, and now we're going to call that backend workflow's name, and it has to be exactly what we call the backend workflow. So if we go to workflows here, we called it flash JSON. So I'm just going to copy that, go to plugins, then paste it after that slash that we've added on there. So the last thing we need to do to this API call is actually make it a post, because we're going to be sending data to our own API. And then what we're going to be putting in here is that input that we're going to be sending to the actual backend workflow itself. So if we do a curly bracket, define what we're doing using speech marks, call it input, the speech marks, colon, and then we do speech marks here, make a dynamic value of input, which is going to be the multi-line input, do speech marks again, and then do the curly bracket. That will be perfect. What we need to be doing to initialize this is going to be giving it that JSON payload, because this is going to be calling our backend workflow, which is going to be adding the application JSON onto it, and then we get the response back, which is the JSON object itself. And so it's the actual ChatGPT response format that goes into here. So what I'm going to do, if we go to our ChatGPT API call, if you hit manually enter API response, you can get that call back without having to do another call. And I'm just going to copy everything between the speech marks, because that is the type of JSON we're going to be having or using. And I'm going to paste that into here. And if we initialize, you can see now we've got the front and the back formatted as a JSON object, which is fantastic. So if we save that, now we are ready to move on to displaying all of the data in our UI here. So we've done our backend workflow that adds the application JSON formatting. We've done the API call that calls that backend workflow and then gives us a payload back, which we can use as an object. And so let's go into how we can plumb this into the actual groups here. So we're going to do some changes to these and these once we've get a little bit further, but let's start now. So if we go to our design tab for our flashcards screen here, we now want to make sure the data is correct for this. So the type of content, you can see we've got the options to have plugin types, and we called our API get flashcard JSON. Now we can have get flashcard JSON, which is like the whole object, but we're going to want to actually get our flashcards itself, which is the get JSON and then choice here. So here again, what we want to get is the repeating group flashcards list of get flashcards JSON choices. Perfect. Then feed it through to here. So the type of content again, pick exactly the same thing. Get flashcard JSON choices, data source, current cells, get flashcard JSON choice. So essentially the choice means flashcard. So it's going to be the current flashcard. This was a list of flashcards. And then our text is going to be the parent get flashcards. Sorry, Kevin, we're going to maybe need maybe this. Okay. Sorry, Kevin. Let's start again then. So the first thing we're going to do is plug object into this repeating group here. So where do we get our object from? It's this trigger backend, or whatever you called the API call to our app itself. So if we go to the design tab, we're going to want to go to the repeating group, find type of content, trigger backend is what we called it. and the data source is repeat include flashcards, list of backends. So now it's basically that list of flashcards now. So for the group, let's make it trigger backends again. It's going to be the current sales, trigger backend, so flashcard. You can see we can have our front or back of the flashcard itself. And we're going to have our text set to be the front. So I'm just going to add 20 pixels on the left and right here so it doesn't bump into so it's not flush to the sides of the actual flashcard itself here. And now this is set up pretty much fully here. We're going to do one thing, which is if we actually click on the repeating group itself, if we check collapse when hidden, so it disappears completely from the screen when we set a condition, we make it not visible on page load, and then set a condition, which is when this repeating group's list of trigger backends, which is the flashcards, so I probably could have named that a bit better, count is not, and then 0, this element is visible. So when we have generated flashcards, it will appear, essentially. Okay, let's get on to actually the generation button workflow here. So if we click on that, give the appearance, add a workflow. We're actually only going to be having 2 actions for this, so it's super quick. The first one is going to be that API call to OpenAI, which we called OpenAI flashcards get flashcard JSON. And our lecture material in here, instead of going to be that preset, because we use that dynamic data with the greater than less than signs, we can now use the multi-line input A's value. And we'll come back to this in a second. And then we're going to go here, and then how we actually call this API is kind of interesting. Before I learned how to do this, I didn't actually realize you could do an API call like this, but we're actually going to display a list in a repeating group. That repeating group is already going to be our flashcards repeating group, and the data source is going to be get data from an external API. So this is going to actually do our API call for us. So it's going to be doing that trigger response API call, which then triggers the backend workflow, and then we get our response back, which is then automatically displaying that object, that JSON object, in our repeating group. So we've got my application trigger backend here. Now, if this isn't here, it's because you would have turned it into an action instead of a data. Here, you would have it as an action, and it should be data. So we're going to grab that, and now we can actually set our API call itself. The input is going to be what ChatGPT gives us, and it's going to be its choices message content. Perfect. We're just going to leave that as so. So I think right now we're running into a bit of an issue here with it not formatting properly, because when we formatted this call, I only actually did one object, so it's not a list, so it doesn't like it in a repeating group. So if we again go to our flashcards here, maybe put in a much bigger section of text, copy it, and then paste it into here, we can go down into our raw data and get a response with more than one output here. Save it, pop it into our API call, reinitialize. So we've got front back. Okay, so that's technically a list. So now when we go to our workflows, we've now got an option to actually grab our flashcards here. And now it's not working because we've plumbed in data to expect just the actual API call, but now we need to actually grab our flashcards here. So you can see now we've got trigger backend, and we've also got trigger backend flashcards. So now we can actually grab the flashcards here. Sorry about this, everyone. List of trigger backends, flashcards. Perfect. Flashcards. Nice. Now, when we go back to our workflow here, we have got it in blue. Lovely. So now this is the actually only thing we need to do. However, we've got some issues. If we were just to run this, as you can see, and let's just paste all of this in here. Okay, that'll be enough. If we paste all this in, do step by step and hit generate, you can see we get a error come up. which is we cannot freeze the JSON body of the request. Blah, 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 blah. Now, this is because bubble, when there's certain things, number one, in here, like these characters, they're actually used in the JSON language. So then it thinks it's JSON and it doesn't like it and it doesn't format correctly, for one. And for two, when we send this payload to bubble here again to get converted, it again recognizes the different elements to it, not as JSON. So what we're going to be doing is what's called a JSON safe. Now, JSON safe is, as it says, converts it to a format where it's safe to send it and it won't interfere with the JSON. So let's turn on multi-line input. If there's any, those characters that are going to mess it up, we need this to be JSON safe. So if you just type in format as JSON safe, perfect. And then here again, if we click the application aspect, that we're sending it to the API, for the backend workflow to convert. Bubble's going to get confused. So again, going to want to convert this as a JSON safe. But this again introduces some more issues, because when you format as a JSON safe, it adds those speech marks either side. So we're going to need to, if we actually demonstrate that, you'll see it doesn't like it. And that's because it's going to be adding those speech marks. And in JSON, if we actually look, we only need one speech mark. So it'd be speech marks and then speech marks again. And then this is why it's messing it up. So how are we going to get past that? So here on the lecture materials, we're going to get rid of the speech marks and then add it into our response like it would be when it's a JSON safe. And again, we've got to reinitialize that call. So bubble updates, and then do the exact same thing for this input here as well. Reinitialize that call. It all works. And now when we go here, we paste in our text. We finally have no bugging issues. So I've just done that just to illustrate, if you run into any debugging issues, that's why. So we can see we're getting this data back. This is what's going into the backend workflow, and then we can see it all formatted, and then we've got our flashcards here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If we run next, we get our window appearing here with our flashcards. But the last thing we need to do is actually have this change to the front and back, which we're going to be using dynamic states for. But if we just do this, action for generation button, done. So we do the custom state, the action, and the animations for the card. So if we go to the design tab, we're just going to set a state, custom state for this card itself. And that's how, if you set this state for this, it would just change all of them. But we only want it to change one card when we click that one card. So we're going to be putting the custom state here. So if we click the I, that's where we create our custom states. It's going to be front, yes and no. Default to yes. You could potentially have a button where it's like show back first, and then you could change this state, but we're not doing that in this video. So once we've set up that state, we're going to want to add a condition. The condition is when, and we've called this group card. So when group card, and now you can see we've got custom state front is no, so we're showing the back. The background color is going to be blue at 10%. And if we see that, I like how that color looks. Sweet. Now let's copy this condition, because we're going to go to our text here, paste a condition in. And the condition is when the group card front is no, so when the back is being shown, we want this text to, instead of be the parent group's flashcards front, we want it to be the back. Perfect. So now we've set up those conditions. We can set an action on this card by going to appearance and add a workflow that when this card is clicked, we can set a state of an element. That element is going to be group card, the front state, and we're going to set the value to no. And we're going to click this workflow. And we only want this to happen when this group card front is yes. And then we're going to copy this and do it for the exact reverse. scenario. So when it's no, so when the back's showing, then we want to turn it to the front, which is yes. So if we preview this application again, let's use a different essay. Hardest lessons for startups. Lovely. Very useful. I shall be learning all of these flashcards for hours after this tutorial has been completed. So we're going to hit generate and just hit run. What is on releasing the first version of Startup? Perfect. Now we've got change. Now you can obviously see all the different other features you could add, etc., etc. You could add like a slightly different prompt into the GPT system instruction. You could do lots of different bits and bobs. Even potentially link to some form of image API and display an image for each card automatically. You see where I'm going with this. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed watching this tutorial. I had a bunch of fun doing this one. And yeah, hopefully it's very helpful for the projects you're building. Let us know in the comments what you're building. And if you have any questions, do my best to reply and help you out. Cheers.
And just like that, you now have a custom quiz or flashcards app that you created without having to write a single line of code. Look, if you found this video useful and you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble resources we share, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button on my channel so that way you can be the first to know whenever we drop a new tutorial. For now though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this course, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.